Welcome to the official YouTube channel for the Colin Cowherd podcast. Go on, hit the subscribe button. There it is, so you don't miss any of our football content this season. It has been, if I might say, fantastic. I took a brutal beating. In the early games, I not only went 0 for 4, they all got blown out. I've never had one of those. I've had bad weekends. I've not been on the wrong side of everything. And I liked Army. I mean, everything went wrong. Thank God there wasn't a big college football weekend. So let's start with Philadelphia. Jalen Hurts. I mean, the guy had nothing but time. The O-line for Philadelphia was fantastic. He's 25 of 32, 2 touchdowns, no picks. I mean, it was really to watch him kind of do whatever he wanted to do in the second half. 27-13 Philadelphia. Now George Pickens was out. For Pittsburgh, he was a go either way. If I could do it over again, I wouldn't have taken the Steelers with him out again. I guess it's the hamstring. But I that second half for Philadelphia, I can say all I want about Nick Sirianni. That second half, I mean, we always say script first half, second half is players. I don't know what to make of it. I mean, Pittsburgh's defense, they clinched, by the way, a playoff spot, even losing because of the Chargers loss. What did you make of Philadelphia? It's kind of jaw-dropping.
I was pacing around before the afternoon game started, and I thought about putting a large wager on the Steelers' money line. And I thought about 10 minutes into that game, it was obvious the Steelers were in major trouble. They could not cover the 2 wide receivers. The game plan's always going to be to corral Saquon Barkley. Well, they held him. He didn't sniff 100 yards.
Yeah.
Well, A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith had 20 catches over 200 yards, and they each had a touchdown. I mean, that had to be, given the circumstance and the level of competition, one of Jalen's best games in a long, long time. He was under complete control. Kellen Moore, I thought the 2 coordinators, Kellen Moore and Vic Fangio, dominated that game. And listen, Sirianni's the head coach, so he's getting credit too. I mean, that was a dominant team effort, start to finish.
Yeah, Najee Harris's fumble, the little bit of life Pittsburgh had in the second half when Najee Harris fumbles as they're driving in. They weren't taking a lead, but they were competitive.
Yeah.
It was funny. They only had 80 first half yards and they only trailed 17-13. So I'm like, God, if they can just muster 250, they have a chance to pull it out. And then Najee Harris fumbled. It's one of those things, and I try to avoid this. I try to avoid confirmation bias. And I mean, Dan Campbell is what he is, even today with that onside kick. He's just a risk taker. I don't like his situational football. But I do feel like Sirianni's one of those coaches. I used to cover Mike Bellotti was the coach of Oregon, and I always thought Mike was a good coach, highly dependent on his coordinators. So, and that's okay. I didn't feel that as much with Belichick or an Andy Reid, especially Andy Reid. But Steve Spagnuolo obviously elevates him. But is it possible that Sirianni's a solid to good coach, highly reliant on coordinators, and it looks like he's hit on 2 more? So he had 2 hits, 2 misses, and 2 hits.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of CEO head coaches are very dependent on coordinators. Sirianni is an offensive guy and he can't call the offense. So it's a pretty unique circumstance. I mean, Tomlin's defenses are always awesome, and he obviously has a huge role in that. If you watch that, 4-team Hard Knocks, he's sitting in with the defense. He plays a big role in the mentality. Sirianni, I mean, he's getting into it at the end of the game with Jalen Carter and the defensive line coach and Big Dom separating everybody. After it's just the Eagles have an infrastructure of they're like a collegiate team that's like Georgia or LSU, where they got a pipeline to elite players, and it starts with the front office and Howie Roseman. I mean, they got good players everywhere. I mean, their defensive line, they invest the offensive line, the coaching staff. He inherits Stoutland, who is an incredible offensive line coach. I think, Brady was on that call. He's talking about, Mekhi Becton was a disaster with the Jets. They're like, yeah, we'll take him and we'll move him to right guard, and then he'll be one of the better guards in the season, in the year. How many teams could have pulled that off? Probably not many. So they're really good at talent evaluation. They take big swings and they hit on a lot of them. I talked to a buddy over the last week about Jalen Carter. Jalen Carter could not have functioned in a lot of places. I think some of the teams that passed on him, like Atlanta, get a lot of shit. The Eagles were uniquely equipped. I think with, veteran defensive linemen. They had Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham still around. And now Vic Fangio around him can really, Vic's been around the block a few times, but the talent today, the Eagles just have more talent. And Russell Wilson, he's been good this season, but you remove George Pickens and you saw today
Yes.
against a better team, it was like, whoa, they got issues. I mean, their passing game, tight end's a good player, but outside, little guy Austin can only do so much. What's he? He's not that tall of a guy. So Russell doesn't have his DK Metcalf, his George Pickens, where he can just throw that lollipop to. You felt it today, big time.
Yeah, you feel with a lot of teams in the NFL. I mean, obviously the Bills are very much led by Josh Allen,
Yeah.
but you feel with certain teams, like even good teams, you feel you're sort of led by an individual player. Pittsburgh without George Pickens, it's just not the same team. But you start watching Philadelphia today, and there are Sundays that Saquon Barkley and the O line dominate. Today it was their wide receivers and Jalen Hurts. Sometimes it's their defensive front. I don't know. I watched Philadelphia today, and I don't want to overreact. And I'm looking at some notes here. It is really hard to watch that game today with Philadelphia, and I'm looking at some notes here. Pittsburgh's first half offense, 2.7 yards a play. I mean, how do you not put the Eagles in the Super Bowl? Nothing against Detroit. I love their offense. They are so beat up defensively now that
Lost a
I
defensive
watched
lineman today.
Philadelphia. I watched Philadelphia, and I'm like, I don't even think Detroit matches up with them. Do you?
No, well, not right now with their defense. I mean, they lost McNeil today to a foot injury, immediately out. They've already missing a bunch of guys. One thing that jumped out to me this week is when the AJ Brown thing happened on Sunday, and then Brandon Graham goes on his radio show and basically says, they're calling it fake news. Like the story wasn't created by the media; it was created by their player saying they don't like each other. So I was pretty excited to see Sirianni in that press conference because even he kind of opens up like, I know we got a big game this week, but I understand the questions aren't going to be about that. I thought it was pretty impressive the way he handled the press conference in regards to AJ and Jalen. And
Yeah.
you talk about a guy who's been under the firing line now for a couple of years in the pressure cooker of Philadelphia. Just the way he kind of just, I would say, dimmed the fire. He couldn't put it out because that's not going to happen in Philadelphia, but he could settle it a little bit. And by game time, he's got 8 catches, 110 yards, and a touchdown. And everyone knew that they were going to, involve him in the offense, but he was really involved in the offense. So now everyone's happy. The great part about the NFL, unlike a lot of industries where it's like half the company doesn't care about the quarterly earnings, in football, if you win, it'll quiet everyone down. If you get a wide receiver a few passes, everyone will take a deep breath. And that's what happened. So it's like, oh, how are they going to look? Because if it went weird today with Jalen and AJ,
Yeah.
and they even if they won, it'd be like, oh, something's still up. No one can say anything now.
Well, and I also think sometimes, and I keep going back to Sirianni, but people do, even talented people, they learn on the job. I've told the story before. I had a friend. She was really talented, and she took a job. She was working at Oracle for years and years, and she took a job at Google. And she said the first 6 months she was terrified. She literally would drive to work panicking. I don't know what I'm doing. And I remember telling her, like, that's what you should be doing in life. You should never be ready for a job. You should be qualified, talented enough to excel, but who's ready to coach the Philadelphia Eagles? That's
Nobody.
never been a head coach.
No.
Like, I mean, Chip Kelly's like got caught between the crosshairs of Howie and Lurie and the media, and Chip Kelly'd been a head coach. And I think Philadelphia is just uniquely difficult. It's a hard place to coach. The media has impact. The GM's the strongest and the most opinionated in the league. I mean, you work for the organization. There are tough places to coach in this league. Green Bay, no owner, small media, very, I would say, static, stoic front office, no yellers, no screamers, Mark Murphy. That's a pretty easy, and they get the quarterback right. So you almost always have a quarterback. Philadelphia is one of the rare, excellent franchises, very difficult to coach.
You also didn't, obviously in the climate now with social media and the internet, I would imagine when Andy took over in the late 90s for Ray Rhodes, it was intense then, but it's got to be on steroids now with the version of the internet and the pressure with social media with all the players. I think you left out a key figure too. Is the owner's got opinions, Colin? Now, I wouldn't call Jeffrey Lurie is a very supportive, he's a great owner to work for because the checkbook's always open, anything you need. But he's got takes. I mean, listen, I wasn't invited to these meetings, but clearly when Doug got kind of pushed out every week, it wasn't just Howie meeting with him. The owner was there. The owner's son now is involved analytically, the analytic department, because that's kind of Howie's, Howie's, I would call a true hybrid. He does everything. He watches tape, but, from contracts to analytic, like he's involved in it all. So there's just a lot of people in the kitchen, but they function that well or that way, right? They're very comfortable in a dysfunctional, pressure-filled operation because they've been good really now. I mean, the moment Andy showed up, they have really been consistently good. Moving on, I mean, Kyle, they're 12-2. They were just. I mean, last year they were whatever 9-1, 10-1, and they truly fell apart. But they were still 10-1. I mean, think how many teams would just die to even have that ability.
Think about this: they fired Doug Peterson. He won a Super Bowl. They fired Chip Kelly. He had a winning record. I mean, so you start looking at them. Yeah. They've been good for about 25 straight years. Mostly, have been a good franchise.
I think one thing they're really talented at is pivoting. And you talk about this a lot, like they will pivot fast. And when they did that off Carson Wentz and they accumulated all those picks and then they could maneuver, they could trade one pick for A.J. Brown. They still had multiple ones. They're always doing shit. And they're always, I mean, look at the Saquon acquisition. Tomlin this week called it the best acquisition of the offseason. He was available to everybody. Now, I understand he was more inclined, kind of chip on his shoulder for the Giants. But it's not like Howie offered him $50 million. So listen, he wanted to go there. They gave him $27 million guaranteed. We see in free agency, guards are getting 50. So Howie was aggressive, and it's been perfect. But A.J. Brown, why is he on the team? He was aggressive. He gave a first-round pick. They're just very, very aggressive. Listen, you talk about being nervous. It's really served me in my life well. I think since I left the Eagles, that's an intense place to work. And Howie is an intense guy. And if you can handle that and survive that, you could handle most things in life. And he is I still have a lot of friends there, including Howie. His personality is his personality. And it starts there. Sirianni's a high emotional guy. And that's why I think Dom's there to kind of, last year he became a star with a pushing incident with Dre Greenlaw, or became his name. Everyone knew who he was. But he's really there just to calm. Who was in the middle of Jalen Carter, highly emotional, crazy guy who just had an awful penalty, and Sirianni screaming at each other. Dom's right there trying to pull them all back. So I think they just know how to function kind of in dysfunction, and they do it at an extreme. I mean, beside the Chiefs over the last, and like the Bills over the last 4 years, who's won more games?